Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and instantly understood that everything was about to change? Not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't have to say. Today's story asks a question that I genuinely couldn't stop thinking about after I first heard it. What happens when the most powerful being in the known galaxy decides that one ordinary human matters? Stay with me, because the answer is going to surprise you. Reeves had been calibrating sensor arrays for 6 hours when the alert pinged across his console. Docking clearance requested, vessel class unknown, point of origin redacted. In 14 months working as a systems technician aboard Meridian Station, he had processed roughly 40,000 docking requests. He had never once seen the origin field read anything other than a registered star system. He leaned forward in his chair, squinting at the blinking cursor where coordinates should have been, and for approximately 3 seconds he considered flagging it to his supervisor. Then the vessel came into visual range on the external feed, and Reeves stopped thinking about his supervisor entirely. The ship was enormous. Not in the way that cargo freighters were enormous, all bulk and function and industrial indifference. This was enormous the way a cathedral was enormous, with intention, with weight, with the specific kind of presence that made the space around it feel smaller just by existing. Its hull was a deep charcoal grey that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and along its entire length ran markings in a luminescent silver that pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like something breathing. Reeves had catalogued enough alien vessel designs to know that those markings weren't decorative. They were a declaration. He just didn't know what they were declaring yet. His console lit up with 12 simultaneous override codes, each one bypassing a different layer of Meridian's security protocols with the casual ease of someone stepping over a puddle. The station's automated systems, which had flagged the vessel moments earlier, quietly stood down one by one. Reeves watched his entire alert dashboard go dark in the span of 4 seconds and felt something cold settle at the base of his spine. Whatever was on that ship hadn't asked for permission to dock. It had simply informed the station that it would be doing so. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. He was still staring at his console when his colleague Petra rolled her chair next to his, her coffee halfway to her mouth and frozen there. "Is that—" she started. "Yeah," Reeves said. "Do you know whose markings those are?" Reeves pulled up the registry database, cross-referenced the luminescent script against every catalogued symbol set in the Meridian archives, and got exactly one result. The result came back flagged in 3 different colors, each representing a different tier of diplomatic sensitivity. The highest tier was reserved for heads of state. The marking on that ship belonged to a tier they didn't even have a color for. Petra set her coffee down very carefully. "Someone should probably tell Commander Voss," she said. "Someone should probably tell everyone," Reeves replied. By the time the docking seal engaged, Commander Voss had assembled every senior officer on the station in Bay 7, which was the largest docking bay they had, and which now felt, in Reeves's honest assessment, embarrassingly small. The commander was a former military woman who had negotiated with species that communicated exclusively through seismic vibration, and had once talked a pirate coalition into surrendering by sheer force of sustained eye contact. She was not a person who visibly showed nerves. She was showing them now. Reeves noticed because her left hand kept finding the hem of her jacket and smoothing it flat, over and over, a gesture he'd never seen from her before in 14 months. The boarding ramp extended in silence. The crew assembled in Bay 7, 43 people representing 12 different species, collectively held their breath. Nothing emerged for a long moment, just the soft sound of the station's ventilation system and the distant hum of docked engines cooling. And then footsteps. Measured, unhurried, each one landing with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once needed to rush anywhere, because the universe rearranged itself around their schedule. She appeared at the top of the ramp alone. No entourage, no guards, no announcement. Just her. Reeves's brain, which prided itself on rational processing, attempted to categorize what it was seeing and politely failed. The woman who descended the ramp was tall, with deep blue-black skin that seemed to carry its own faint luminescence. Not a reflection of the bay's lighting, but something internal, something that pulsed very faintly in patterns that matched the markings on her ship. Her hair was silver-white, worn back in a way that was purely functional, and her clothing was not armor, not robes, not any formal diplomatic attire he recognized. She wore something simple, something that said she didn't need to dress for power because power dressed itself around her presence. Every senior officer in the bay, including Commander Voss, took one involuntary step backward. Every senior officer except one. Reeves had not meant to be standing at the front. He'd been at the back of the assembly at the edge, the lowest-ranked human in the room, present only because Bay 7 happened to fall under his maintenance rotation and no one had thought to tell him to leave. He had drifted forward without realizing it, drawn by the same instinct that makes people lean towards something extraordinary, even when every sensible part of them says not to. And so when the woman reached the bottom of the ramp and her eyes, pale gold, luminous, ageless, swept across the assembled crew of Meridian Station, they landed on him first. Not on Commander Voss, not on the senior officers arranged in careful diplomatic formation. On Reeves, the technician, the nobody, who was standing in front because he'd forgotten to stay behind. He expected her to look past him. That was the rational outcome. He was standing in the wrong place and she was looking for whoever was in charge, and her gaze would simply move on, the way important gazes always moved on when they landed on unimportant people. Instead, she stopped. She looked at him with an expression that wasn't curiosity exactly. It was more like recognition. The look someone gives when they find a thing they've been searching for in the last place they expected. The silence in Bay 7 had already been significant. What happened next made it absolute. She turned to Commander Voss, to the senior officers, to the entire assembled authority of Meridian Station, and in a voice that required no amplification, in a language that every translator implant on the station rendered perfectly and simultaneously, she spoke 4 words. That human is mine. Not a question, not a greeting, not a diplomatic opening. A statement delivered with the total serenity of someone announcing a fact about the physical universe. And then, before anyone could respond, before Commander Voss could find her voice, or the senior officers could exchange a single glance, she looked back at Reeves. "Come," she said simply, and waited. Reeves stood there in the ringing silence of Bay 7, 42 beings staring at him, the most powerful figure any of them had ever encountered in a professional context, looking at him with patient gold eyes, and thought, I really should have stayed at the back. Nobody moved. That was the thing Reeves would remember afterward. Not the silence, not the shock written across Commander Voss's face, not even the words themselves. What he would remember was that 42 beings, representing 12 different species, every single one of them more experienced and more senior, and more qualified to handle this moment than he was, stood completely frozen. And he was the one who had to decide what to do next. His brain ran through the options with the desperate efficiency of a system trying to process too many inputs at once. Walk forward and find out what mine meant in whatever context this extraordinary woman intended. Stand still and risk insulting someone whose ship had bypassed 14 layers of station security without pausing to apologize. Step backward and hide behind Commander Voss, which was technically the most appealing option, but almost certainly the worst one diplomatically. The woman, whoever she was, whatever she was, simply waited, patient, unhurried, like she had already calculated every possible response he might give and had decided in advance that she could outlast all of them. He walked forward, not confidently, not with any of the composure the moment probably deserved. He walked forward the way a person walks toward a very large, unfamiliar animal, careful, steady, trying not to make any sudden movements that might change the situation from complicated to catastrophic. He stopped a reasonable distance from her, close enough to be respectful, far enough to feel like he was maintaining some small fragment of agency over his own physical location. "Hi," he said, and immediately recognized that as possibly the worst opening statement in the history of interstellar diplomacy. Something shifted in her expression. It was small, a fractional change around her eyes, a slight adjustment of her chin, but it was unmistakably amusement. She had found his greeting funny. Reeves found this simultaneously comforting and deeply unnerving. "You are the technician designated Reeves," she said. It was not a question. Her accent in Standard was faultless in a way that suggested the language was something she had absorbed completely rather than learned gradually, the way children absorbed languages, deep and structural, not studied on the surface. "That's me," Reeves said, then added, "How do you know my name?" Because it seemed like relevant information to have. "I know a great many things," she replied, which was exactly the kind of answer that answered nothing while somehow feeling completely sufficient. She studied him for a moment longer, those gold eyes moving across him with the calm thoroughness of someone reading a document they have been waiting a long time to read. Then she said, "Walk with me," and turned toward the station corridor as if the matter was settled. Commander Voss found her voice at precisely that moment. "Excuse me." Her tone was the one she reserved for situations that required authority delivered without aggression. Firm, professional, carefully calibrated. "I'm afraid I need to understand what's happening here before anyone goes anywhere. You've bypassed our security clearance, you haven't filed diplomatic credentials, and I don't have a name to put in my incident report, which I am absolutely going to have to file." The woman stopped walking, turned back with the slow deliberateness of someone who was not accustomed to being stopped. The temperature in Bay 7 did not literally drop. Reeves was fairly certain of that, but it felt like it did. Like the room itself was reconsidering its choices. "My name," she said, with a quietness that somehow carried more weight than volume, "is Sova, Empress of the Keth Dominion, Sovereign of the Outer Reaches, Keeper of the Ninth Accord." She let that settle, watched Commander Voss process the information with visible effort. "You may file whatever documentation your protocols require, but the human comes with me." She looked back at Reeves. Now, Reeves had looked up the Keth Dominion exactly once during his career, in a mandatory cross-cultural briefing module that he had completed at 2 in the morning before a shift and retained approximately 30% of. What he retained was this: the Keth Dominion was not a nation in the conventional sense. It was not a government that had grown through politics or commerce or the slow accumulation of treaties. It was a dominion in the oldest meaning of the word, a territory defined by one individual's reach, and that individual's reach currently extended across 63 inhabited systems, 4 disputed territories, and an unknown number of deep space installations that nobody outside the Dominion had ever mapped. The Empress of the Keth Dominion was not a head of state. She was, for all practical purposes, the state. He was being asked to go somewhere alone with the equivalent of a small empire in humanoid form. "Okay," he said, because apparently this was his week for choices with significant consequences. The corridor outside Bay 7 felt different with Sova walking through it. Not louder, quieter actually. Every crew member they passed did a version of the same thing. Looked up, registered what they were seeing, and found somewhere else urgently important to direct their attention. Not from rudeness, from the specific kind of instinctive deference that happened when the body understood something before the mind did. Reeves walked beside her, acutely aware that he was still wearing his maintenance uniform, which had a grease smear on the left sleeve from where he'd been working on a coolant relay 3 hours ago. He'd been calibrating sensors. He had not dressed for this. "You're wondering why you?" Sova said. She had not looked at him. She was surveying the corridor with calm attention, as though cataloguing everything. "Loudly, yes," Reeves admitted. "I'm not being subtle about the confusion." "No," she agreed. "You are not. That is one of the reasons. Confusion is a selling point." "Honesty," she corrected. "Confusion honestly expressed is still honesty. Most beings in your situation would have performed composure. You did not perform. You simply reacted." She glanced at him briefly. "It is rare." She stopped at a viewport, one of the long ones running along the station's outer corridor, looking out into the dark scatter of stars and the soft glow of the nearest transit lane. Reeves stopped beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was a different kind from the one in Bay 7. less pressurized, more like the silence between two people figuring out where a conversation is actually supposed to begin. 3 days ago, Sova said, a Keth diplomatic vessel made an unscheduled stop at this station for resupply. Standard procedure. No special attention required. She paused. One of my people was separated from the group in the commercial sector, a child, 8 years old by your reckoning. She did not speak standard. She was frightened, and she was alone. She stopped. Reeves felt something tighten in his chest, already assembling what came next. She was in the corridor near Maintenance Access 7, he said quietly. Yes, Sova replied. You found her. You sat on the floor so you would not be taller than her. You did not call security immediately because you recognized that a stranger in uniform arriving quickly would frighten her more. You used a translation matrix on your personal device, not a station device, your personal one, meaning you paid for the upgrade yourself, to find 3 words in Keth that you then mispronounced significantly, but tried anyway. Something in her voice shifted, barely, like the difference between still water and water that has just been touched. She stopped crying. Reeves remembered. A small girl with silver-tinted skin and wide, dark eyes, sitting against the corridor wall with her knees pulled up, shaking. He'd had a half-eaten protein bar in his pocket and a translation app he'd downloaded 6 months ago out of pure curiosity. He had not done anything that felt remarkable. He had done what seemed obvious. I sat with her until the search team came, he said. That's all. That, Sova said, turning to look at him with those still gold eyes, was my daughter. The viewport looked out at the stars. Reeves looked at the stars. He thought about a small girl and a corridor floor and 3 badly mispronounced words in a language he'd learned from an app. He thought about how small that moment had felt at the time and how very large it apparently was. Oh, he said. Sova's expression did the almost amusement thing again. You have a remarkable gift for understatement, she said. I'm processing, Reeves said. I can see that. Your daughter, he said carefully. The heir to the Keth Dominion? Yes. Was the child I gave half a protein bar to and tried to entertain with a translation app until your people arrived. The protein bar was reportedly very important to her account of the event, Sova confirmed. She mentioned it 4 times. Reeves turned to look at her directly. What does that human is mine actually mean? Because I want to make sure I understand what I've agreed to by walking out here with you. Sova was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried something underneath the authority, something quieter and more careful, like a door opening rather than a wall holding. It means, she said, that you are under my protection, permanently, unconditionally, whatever you need, wherever you are, for the remainder of your life. The full weight of the Keth Dominion stands behind you. She paused. It also means that certain parties who have recently taken an interest in this station and in the specific humans employed here will need to reconsider that interest immediately. Reeves stared at her. What parties? She looked back at the stars, her profile calm and absolute, and said, That is what we need to discuss. Reeves had always considered himself a fairly self-aware person. He knew his strengths, methodical thinking, patience with complicated systems, an ability to stay functional under moderate stress. He knew his limitations, poor spatial awareness in unfamiliar environments, a tendency to talk when silence would serve him better, and apparently a complete inability to notice when someone had decided he was worth hunting. Because that was what Sova was telling him, that somewhere between his maintenance rotations and his sensor calibrations and his very ordinary 14 months aboard Meridian Station, he had become interesting to people he had never met and never wanted to meet. The protein bar incident, it turned out, had consequences that extended considerably beyond a small girl's positive memory of it. Sova walked as she talked, which Reeves was beginning to understand was her natural state. She was not someone who stood still while doing important things. She led him through the station's upper corridor ring, the one with longer viewports and less foot traffic, and she spoke in the measured, factual tone of someone delivering a briefing they had prepared carefully. Not because the information was simple, because she had decided he deserved to receive it without unnecessary alarm layered on top of the actual content. He appreciated that. He also recognized that the actual content was alarming enough on its own. "The Veth Consortium," she said, "has been acquiring human-occupied stations along this transit corridor for approximately 2 years. Not through violence, through leverage. They identify something the station needs, a supply contract, a security guarantee, a debt arrangement, and they use that need to establish dependency. Once the dependency exists, the terms change." Reeves processed this. "That sounds like a protection racket," he said, "at an interstellar scale." "Yes," Sova said simply, "that is exactly what it is." He had heard of the Veth Consortium the way most people in his position heard of large, powerful organizations, peripherally, abstractly, the way you heard about weather systems in regions you'd never visited. They were a commercial entity with significant reach. They moved cargo, brokered contracts, facilitated trade across a dozen systems. He had never had any particular reason to think about them more carefully than that. "What does any of this have to do with me specifically?" he asked. Sova glanced at him sideways. 2 months ago, the Veth Consortium made a formal approach to Meridian Station's administrative board. They offered a supply arrangement, favorable terms, reliable delivery, long-term contract. The board was interested. Negotiations began. She paused at a viewport, looking out at the transit lane where 3 commercial vessels moved in slow sequence toward their docking approaches. 3 weeks into negotiations, one of the consortium's representatives requested the station's personnel records as part of their due diligence process. Standard practice, ostensibly. The board complied. Reeves felt the cold thing at the base of his spine again. "They pulled my file." "They pulled your file," Sova confirmed, and 12 hours later, their approach to the negotiations changed. Suddenly they were less interested in supply contracts and considerably more interested in specific personnel transfers as part of the arrangement, yourself included. He turned to look at her fully. "Why? I calibrate sensors. I fix coolant relays. I have a grease stain on my uniform right now from a maintenance job I was doing when your ship arrived. I am the least strategically significant person on this station." "You are the person," Sova said carefully, "who spent 6 months learning Keth on a personal translation application, who knows the maintenance access layout of this station in enough detail to move through it without being tracked by internal sensors, who has, in 14 months, developed functional working relationships with crew members from 9 of the 12 species currently stationed here." She looked at him steadily. "The Veth Consortium does not collect people for what they are today. They collect people for what they could be made into tomorrow." The word "collect" landed badly. Reeves noticed this about himself. The word landed, and he felt the specific discomfort of someone who had just discovered they had been categorized as an object without their knowledge or consent. He filed the feeling away for later because later seemed like a better time to have feelings about it. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "Since the day after the personnel request was filed," Sova said. "My intelligence network monitors consortium activity in this corridor as a matter of standard practice. When your name appeared in their communications, I was informed." "Because of your daughter?" "Because of my daughter," she confirmed. There was something in the way she said it, not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular weight of a person who did not use emotional language carelessly, saying something that carried emotion anyway. "She spoke about you for 3 days after the resupply stop, about the man who sat on the floor, about the words he tried to say, about the fact that he stayed until she was safe, even though staying made him late for his shift and he would have known that." She paused. "I had you investigated after the 2nd day, thoroughly." "That's either very reassuring or fairly alarming," Reeves said. "Both," Sova said, with the ghost of something that might have been a smile. "But the investigation produced a consistent picture. You are exactly what you appear to be. That is rarer than you understand." They had reached a section of the upper corridor that Reeves recognized as unused, a stretch of the station originally designed for expansion that had never been completed, with sealed doorways and a viewport that looked out toward the dark side of the station's rotation, away from the transit lanes, into open space. Sova stopped here. The choice of location was not accidental, he realized. No foot traffic, no monitoring stations. She had memorized the station layout before she arrived. Of course she had. The consortium's representative is currently aboard Meridian Station, she said. They arrived 2 days before I did, under a commercial registry that your security systems would not have flagged as unusual. They have been monitoring your movements. Reeves absorbed this, looked at the sealed doors, the empty corridor, the familiar maintenance panels he could have serviced in his sleep, his ordinary station, his ordinary life. "And now you're here," he said. "And now I am here," Sova agreed, "which changes the calculation significantly. Because if the Empress of the Keth Dominion publicly claims someone as being under her protection, the consortium can't touch them without declaring open conflict with 63 systems and their combined military and economic infrastructure," Sova finished. "Correct," she held his gaze. "I said it publicly, in Bay 7, in front of witnesses representing multiple species who will have transmitted the information to their respective networks within hours. The declaration is already propagating." Reeves leaned against the viewport, looking at the stars, and thought about Bay 7 and 42 frozen beings, and 4 words delivered in a voice that required no amplification. "You didn't just come here to tell me," he said slowly. "You came here to make a statement. To the consortium, where everyone could hear it." "Yes." "So that it would spread?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The child, your daughter, she's all right? After the incident on the station?" The question clearly surprised her. He watched it register, a brief disruption of her composure, genuine rather than performed, as though she had been prepared for many possible responses to everything she had just told him and had not specifically prepared for this one. "She is well," Sova said, and her voice was different for those 3 words, softer, more dimensional, the voice of a person rather than an empress. "She asks about you, whether you were real or whether she remembered it differently than it happened." "She remembered it right," Reeves said. "I just sat with her." "Just," Sova repeated, the word carrying the specific weight of someone who understood exactly how much was contained in it. "You keep using that word about things that were not small." He shrugged, the gesture automatic. "They felt small at the time." "Most important things do," she said. The ventilation system hummed through the walls. Somewhere on the station's lower decks, Reeves's console was probably generating a backlog of maintenance alerts that he was going to have to deal with eventually. He thought about the consortium representative somewhere on the station right now, tracking his movements, calculating his usefulness, having absolutely no idea that the morning had gone the way it had gone. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Sova said, straightening slightly, the Empress returning to her posture the way a coat settles back onto shoulders. "The consortium's representative will receive a formal communication from my office within the hour. They will understand that their interest in you is no longer a viable commercial consideration. And if they don't accept that—" She looked at him with those gold eyes and said, with complete and quiet certainty, "They will accept it." Reeves believed her immediately and without reservation. He also believed something else that she hadn't said directly, but that hung in the space between her words, that this was not finished. That 4 words in a docking bay and 1 formal communication were the beginning of something, not the resolution of it. The consortium did not become what it was by accepting setbacks quietly. "You're staying on the station," he said, not a question. A beat of silence. "For a time," Sova said. "There are matters that require direct attention." "Matters," he repeated, "or one matter specifically?" She did not answer, which was, Reeves was learning, its own kind of answer. He pushed off the viewport and straightened his maintenance uniform, the grease smear on his sleeve catching the corridor light. "I should probably tell Commander Voss something useful," he said. "She's going to have questions. She has already received a full diplomatic briefing from my communications officer." Sova said.
Standard protocol.
Of course she has. He started back toward the main corridor, then stopped, turned. Your daughter, he said. Does she have a name I can actually pronounce? The almost smile appeared again, clearer this time, more certain of itself. Mira, Sova said. We simplified it for transit records. Mira, he repeated. Tell her the translation app has gotten better. I've added more vocabulary. Sova watched him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, something layered and careful and quietly significant. I will tell her, she said. He nodded once and walked back toward the lit corridors and his waiting console and the very ordinary shape of his day, which had become something else entirely and would not be going back.
Commander Voss called Reeves into her office at 1400 station time, which gave him approximately 3 hours after the corridor conversation to sit at his console, stare at his maintenance queue, and process the information that someone had been watching him move through his own station, like a piece on a board he hadn't known he was playing on. He fixed 2 sensor arrays and replaced a coolant coupling during those 3 hours. His hands knew what to do even when his brain was elsewhere. He had always been grateful for that, the way technical work anchored him when abstract things became too large to hold still. By the time he knocked on the commander's office door, he had achieved something close to functional calm, which lasted approximately until he walked in and found Sova already seated across from Voss's desk, composed and unhurried, as though she had simply chosen this chair some time ago and saw no reason to vacate it. Voss gestured him to the remaining chair with the expression of someone who had revised their understanding of their own day several times already and was managing the process with professional dignity. Sit down, Reeves. He sat. Sova did not look at him when he entered, but he had the impression, irrational, unverifiable, that she had registered exactly how long it had taken him to arrive and what the delay said about his current mental state. The Empress has briefed me on the consortium situation, Voss said, folding her hands on her desk with the careful deliberateness of someone organizing their thoughts into a manageable shape. Specifically the personnel request and what followed from it. I want to be honest with you. I reviewed the original negotiation records after that conversation, and the request for personnel transfers was framed in language I should have flagged. I didn't flag it. She paused. That's on me. You didn't know what you were looking at,
Reeves said, because it was true, and because Voss was a fair commander, and fairness worked in both directions. Neither did I, and it was my name in their file. Regardless, Voss said, the station's security posture needs adjustment. We've been operating on the assumption that a commercial entity with a clean trade record poses no security concern. That assumption is no longer supportable. She glanced at Sova. The Empress has offered to share her intelligence network's dossier on consortium activities in this corridor. I've accepted. Reeves looked at Sova. That's generous. It is practical, Sova said. Her voice in the enclosed office space was different from how it had been in the corridor, not smaller but more precise, the way a focused beam of light was not smaller than scattered light, just more directed. A stable station on this transit route serves Keth interests. An unstable one does not.
Voss made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the controlled exhale of someone choosing not to say several things.
The consortium's representative has been identified. He's been aboard for 47 hours under a freight inspection credential. Security is monitoring him. Passively, Sova said. The word was not a correction exactly, more like a small, precise adjustment. For now, Voss agreed, with the tone of someone making a mental note. Actively if circumstances change. After the meeting, Reeves expected Sova to return to her ship. That would have been the logical sequence. She had delivered her information. She had made her declaration. She had handled the administrative layer. The practical reasons for her presence had been addressed. Instead, she fell into step beside him as he left Voss's office, which he registered with the particular awareness of someone noticing that the weather has changed without knowing yet what the new weather intends.
He did not ask where she was going,
partly because he suspected she would give him an answer that was technically accurate and informationally incomplete, and partly because he was finding, against his better judgment, that her presence beside him in the corridor felt less strange than it probably should. "You do not have more questions," she said, after they had walked in silence for long enough that the silence had become a thing in itself. "I have approximately 40 questions," Reeves said. "I'm rationing them." "Why?" "Because the answers to the first few are probably going to generate more questions, and I'd like to process in stages rather than drown." Something shifted in her expression, the almost smile again, but with more warmth in it this time, less carefully contained. Like it was becoming less work to let it be visible. "That is a methodical approach," she said. "I calibrate sensors for a living," Reeves said. "Methodical is the approach." They reached a junction in the corridor. Left led to the technical section and his maintenance queue. Right led to the station's observation level, the one with the wide-angle viewports that looked out at the full spread of the transit lanes, and beyond them, open space in every direction. Sova turned right without pausing. Reeves noted this, filed it, followed. The observation level at mid-afternoon was quiet. A few off-duty crew members scattered along the viewport benches, a pair of Danibian engineers consulting a shared data pad, nobody paying significant attention to anyone else. Sova moved to the far end, the section with the widest viewport, and stood looking out at the stars in the way that Reeves was starting to recognize as something she actually did rather than something she performed. She looked at open space the way a person looked at something they had a real relationship with. Long acquaintance, complicated feelings. "Ask one," she said, without turning from the viewport. Reeves stood beside her, looking at the transit lanes, watching a cargo hauler begin its slow approach to the docking queue. "How long has your intelligence network been watching Meridian Station specifically?" he asked. 8 months, Sova said, "since the first consortium approach to the administrative board." "And how long before that were they watching consortium activity in this corridor generally?" 14 months. He processed the timeline. "So they've been watching since approximately when I arrived?" "Approximately." He looked at the cargo hauler. It had a dented secondary hull and mismatched engine casings, the marks of a vessel that had been repaired multiple times with whatever was available. He found it oddly reassuring. "Your daughter told you about the protein bar incident the same day it happened?" "Within hours," Sova said. "She contacted me from the resupply vessel before it had finished docking clearance." There was something in the way she said this, a texture underneath the fact, something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but occupied the space between them. "She was not supposed to be separated from the group," Sova continued. "The resupply stop was meant to be routine. She had been asking to come on transit trips for months, and I had agreed for the first time." She paused. "When I received her communication and understood what had happened, and what had not happened because someone had sat on a corridor floor, She stopped. Reeves waited. He had learned in 3 hours that Sova's pauses were not empty. They were load-bearing. "I do not experience fear in the conventional sense," she said finally. "I have been in situations that would justify it. I have learned to process threat and response without the delay that fear introduces. It is a skill, a necessary one." "But," Reeves said quietly, "but when I understood how close the margin had been," she said, "I experienced something that I believe was its functional equivalent. Briefly, privately." She did not look at him while she said this. Her eyes stayed on the stars. He understood that the not looking was not avoidance. It was the opposite. It was her making space to say something true without the complication of being watched while she said it. "I understand that," Reeves said. "The moments when you realize how thin the line was, they're worse after the fact than the moment itself." "Yes," she said, "exactly that." Silence. The cargo hauler completed its approach and began its docking sequence, hull thrusters firing in short, controlled bursts. "Second question," Reeves said. "You don't have to ration," Sova said. "I've changed the terms." He looked at her profile against the viewport light. "Why did you come yourself? You could have sent someone, a diplomatic envoy, a security team, a formal communication through official channels. Any of those would have accomplished the same thing, putting the consortium on notice. getting me under formal protection. You didn't need to be here personally." She was quiet for a moment that was longer than her usual pauses, longer and differently weighted. "No," she said, "I did not need to be here personally." She offered nothing else. He waited. She did not elaborate. And Reeves, who was methodical by nature and understood that some readings required more than one pass before the data resolved into meaning, did not push. Instead, he looked at the stars beside her and thought about what an empress who commanded 63 systems and did not need to be anywhere she did not choose to be, was doing standing at a viewport on a mid-sized transit station beside a technician with a grease stain on his sleeve, not explaining why she had come herself. He was forming a theory. He was being careful with it. He didn't want to be wrong. The afternoon shift changeover began to move crew through the observation level, and the quiet broke gradually into the ambient sounds of a station returning to its regular rhythm. Reeves's personal communicator chimed with a maintenance alert, a pressure irregularity in the secondary docking ring, routine, something he could handle in 20 minutes. He looked at it, looked at Sova. "I have to go fix something," he said. She turned from the viewport. "Of course. I'll be in secondary docking ring B if anything urgent comes up," he said. Then paused, aware that he had just told the Empress of the Keth Dominion where to find him, as though she were a colleague and not someone who had bypassed 14 security layers before breakfast. She looked at him with those gold eyes and said nothing. But she did not look away, and in the particular grammar of her silences, Reeves was starting to learn the difference between the ones that meant the conversation was over and the ones that meant something was being carefully decided. This was the second kind. He nodded once and left her at the viewport, and did not look back because something told him that if he did, the careful, methodical processing he'd been doing all afternoon would stop being careful or methodical, and he needed it to be both for a little while longer. The pressure irregularity in docking ring B turned out to be a faulty seal coupling, which took him 18 minutes to replace. He was packing his tools when he heard footsteps behind him, not the heavy, purposeful footsteps of someone arriving, but the quieter kind of someone who had been there for a moment already, watching. He did not startle. He finished securing his kit before he turned. Sova stood at the entrance to the maintenance corridor, her posture carrying its characteristic ease, and in her hand she held 2 cups from the station's commissary. She held one out to him. He looked at it, looked at her. "You went to the commissary," he said. "I did," she confirmed. "Mira described the station's coffee as significant," she said. She mentioned it in the same sentence as the protein bar. He took the cup. She kept the other one, which meant she was intending to drink commissary coffee on a maintenance deck, which was not a thing he had anticipated adding to his understanding of this day. He sipped. It was not good coffee. It was, however, exactly the coffee he drank every shift, familiar and reliable and profoundly ordinary. He watched Sova try hers. Her expression remained composed. "It's not good," he said. "No," she agreed. She drank it anyway. They stood in the maintenance corridor of docking ring B, an empress and a technician, drinking bad coffee, and Reeves thought that whatever was happening here, it was something that had no name yet. But it was something. He was becoming increasingly certain of that. The formal communication from Sova's office reached the consortium representative at 0900 the following morning. Reeves was not present for the delivery. He heard about it second-hand from Petra, who had heard about it from a security officer, who had apparently been standing close enough to observe the representative's reaction when he opened the message on his personal communicator and read whatever the Keth Dominion's diplomatic language looked like when it was being politely and comprehensively final. According to the security officer, the representative had read the message twice, set his communicator down on the commissary table with extreme care, and then sat very still for approximately 90 seconds in the manner of someone recalculating a great number of things simultaneously. Then he had calmed his superiors. The conversation had been brief. His superiors had apparently also needed a moment to recalculate. Reeves ate his breakfast and thought about 90 seconds of very still sitting, and found it quietly satisfying in a way he recognized as probably ungenerous and did not particularly try to correct. He had expected that to be the end of it. The consortium representative would withdraw, the supply negotiation would be terminated, Meridian Station would adjust its security protocols, and life would return to something resembling its previous shape. Different, more informed, but structurally similar. He had expected this because it was the logical sequence, and because the alternative required the consortium to respond to a direct declaration from the Empress of the Keth Dominion by escalating, which would have been an extraordinary act of either courage or profound institutional stupidity. He discovered at 1400 station time that the consortium was in fact capable of profound institutional stupidity. He discovered this because that was when 3 additional consortium vessels entered the transit lane and filed docking requests for Meridian Station simultaneously, and the security alert on his console went from a background amber to a sustained and unhappy red. Reeves was in the middle of a diagnostic cycle on the station's external sensor array when the alert changed. He looked at it, looked at the docking request data his console was pulling in real time. 3 vessels, commercial registry, standard cargo class on paper, but the power signatures his sensors were reading did not match the hull configurations being transmitted, which meant the cargo classifications were false, which meant whatever was inside those vessels was heavier and more capacitated than 3 commercial freighters had any business being. He flagged it to security before the thought had fully formed. Then he flagged it to Commander Voss. Then, because 14 months of maintenance work had given him a very clear understanding of what Meridian Station's defensive infrastructure could and could not handle, and because 3 misclassified vessels with anomalous power signatures arriving simultaneously was not a commercial visit, he flagged it to the Keth ship in Bay 7. He was not certain that was within his authority. He did it anyway. Sova was on the station's command deck 11 minutes later. Reeves knew this because he could track her route by the way crew members moved in the corridors near his console feed, the small ripple of attention and adjustment that preceded her wherever she went, people reorganizing themselves around her gravity without fully realizing they were doing it. She arrived at the command deck and Commander Voss briefed her in the clipped, efficient language of 2 people who had already established a functional working dynamic and did not need to waste time on ceremony. Reeves watched from his console as the docking requests remained in a holding pattern. The station had paused them under security review protocol, which bought time but not indefinite time. The 3 vessels were holding position at the transit lane boundary, which was interesting. They had filed the requests and then stopped. They were waiting for something. "They're waiting to see what we do," Reeves said to Petra, who had rolled her chair next to his again with the situational awareness of someone who understood that his console currently had the most relevant data on the station. "They filed the requests to create a decision point," Petra said. "If we approve them, they're inside. If we deny them, they have grounds to claim interference with commercial transit rights." "And if we stall," Reeves said, "they know we're scared." Petra looked at him. "Are we?" "Ask me again in 20 minutes, he said. What happened in those 20 minutes was this. Sova walked to the command deck's primary communications console, indicated to the operator that she required the channel, and opened a direct transmission to the 3 waiting vessels. She did not raise her voice. She did not use formal diplomatic language or reference treaty structures or invoke the specific legal frameworks that governed commercial transit rights in this corridor. She said 11 words. Reeves's console translated them in real time. "You are in range. You are recognized. Choose carefully." That was all. She closed the channel. The command deck was very quiet. On the transit lane feed, the 3 vessels held their position for 47 seconds. Reeves counted, because counting was what his hands did when the rest of him was processing something large, and then the lead vessel began a slow turn. The other 2 followed. Within 4 minutes, all 3 had changed course and were moving away from Meridian Station on a heading that would take them out of the corridor entirely. Voss exhaled slowly. Several crew members on the command deck did similar things with their breathing. Petra said very quietly, 11 words. 11 words, Reeves confirmed. He found Sova afterward in the corridor outside the command deck, standing at a viewport again. The woman had a genuine relationship with viewports, he had concluded, looking at the transit lane where the 3 vessels had been. Her posture was the same as always. He was learning, though, to look past the posture at the smaller things. The set of her jaw, the angle of her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped behind her back with slightly more pressure than usual. "That won't be all of it," he said, coming to stand beside her. He did not preface it or soften it because she had been clear, explicitly and implicitly, that she preferred information delivered without the padding of unnecessary comfort. "No," she agreed, "it will not." They backed down too easily. "They backed down publicly," she corrected, "which is different. Publicly, they cannot escalate without acknowledging that the escalation is a direct challenge to the Dominion. Their governance structure does not permit that level of exposure without internal consensus that takes time to build. So they'll work around the edges," Reeves said. "Indirectly, off the record." "Yes. How long does that take? Building the internal consensus?" Sova was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks, perhaps 8. They are not a fast-moving organization. Their deliberative process is thorough and slow. She glanced at him. It was one of the reasons they preferred acquisition over conflict. Acquisition is quieter. Conflict requires decisions. Reeves did the math on 6 to 8 weeks and what it meant in practical terms. "You're not going back to Keth," he said. Not a question this time. A calculation arriving at its logical result. "Not immediately," she said. "The situation requires direct presence. A declaration without continued visibility is a declaration that can be tested." He nodded slowly. "There are things I should arrange then," he said. "If you're going to be on the station for an extended period, permanent docking for your ship, better than Bay 7 for a vessel that size. Bay 3 is more appropriate. Better sight lines, easier egress. Your crew will need station access credentials that don't require daily renewal, and whoever your communications officer is, they should probably have a direct line to Voss's office, rather than going through standard channels every time." She had turned to look at him while he was talking. He noticed when he finished. Her expression was doing something he hadn't seen from it before, something that was not the almost smile, and not the composed neutrality, and not the rare warmth he'd glimpsed in the maintenance corridor. Something more careful than any of those, more deliberate, like she was deciding whether to let it be visible. "You are arranging for my comfort on this station," she said. "I'm arranging for the practical requirements of an extended diplomatic presence," Reeves said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" she said. It was not quite a question. He held her gaze. "I'll put in the requests this afternoon," he said. "Bay 3 availability, extended crew credentials, direct communications line." He paused. "Do you have dietary requirements I should flag for the commissary? The coffee is non-negotiable, I can't improve that, but the kitchen can accommodate most species if they have advance notice." The careful thing in her expression shifted, became something clearer, less like a decision being made and more like a decision that had already been made, showing itself. "I do not have specific requirements," she said. "Mira, however, has very strong opinions about protein bars." Reeves felt the corner of his mouth move. "I'll see what the commissary stocks," he said, "for when she visits." Sova was quiet for a moment. "You assume she will visit?" "You came yourself," he said simply. "I think she will." He submitted the docking bay transfer request at 16:30. Bay 3 was approved within the hour, which was faster than any bay transfer he had ever processed, which suggested that someone in station administration had been paying close attention to the morning's events and had drawn their own conclusions about the appropriate speed of bureaucratic response. He was finishing the paperwork for the crew credentials when his communicator chimed, a text message from an internal station address he didn't recognize. He opened it. It read, "Bay 3 is adequate. The coffee remains a problem. S." He stared at it for a moment. Then he typed back, "I'll find better coffee. Give me 2 days." The response came in 40 seconds. "I will give you 1. He set his communicator down and returned to the credentials paperwork. And if he was smiling while he did it, there was nobody nearby to notice. The 2 days he had been given one of turned out to be significant for a different reason entirely. Because at 0300 the following morning, His console flagged an anomaly that was not a pressure irregularity or a sensor calibration drift, or any of the routine mechanical concerns that populated his maintenance queue. It was a comm signal, encrypted, originating from inside the station, routing through 3 relay points in a pattern designed to look like background noise. He almost missed it. He would have missed it 6 months ago before he had started teaching himself to read the signal patterns of Keth communications as a side project during quiet shifts, using the same translation application he had downloaded out of curiosity. He recognized the encryption signature because he had seen it in his self-directed study materials. It was consortium encoding. Someone on Meridian Station was transmitting to the consortium vessels that had retreated from the transit lane. Not gone. Waiting. Reeves looked at the signal for a long moment, making sure he was reading it correctly, making sure his pattern recognition was not finding something that wasn't there because he was primed to look for it. Then he looked at it again. Then he picked up his communicator and sent a message to an internal station address he had added to his contacts in the maintenance corridor of Docking Ring B over bad coffee 2 days ago. It was 0300. He sent it anyway. "I found something. Bay 3 when you can." The response came in less than a minute, which meant she had not been asleep, or had not been sleeping deeply, or had been waiting for something she had anticipated before he had. "Coming now." He looked at the encrypted signal still blinking quietly on his console, patient as a problem that knew it had been found, and thought about 6 to 8 weeks of internal consensus building and working around the edges and decisions made off the record. He thought about thin lines and margins and the moments you only understood afterward. He thought about an empress who had come herself when she didn't need to, who drank bad coffee in maintenance corridors, who had sent a communicator message with a dash and an initial like a person rather than a title. And he thought that whatever was on the other end of that encrypted signal had made a serious error in its assessment of what it was dealing with. Not just the Keth Dominion, not just an empress with 63 systems behind her voice, but a technician who had taught himself to read the right patterns out of curiosity at 0300 on a quiet shift, because that was the kind of person he was when no one was watching. The maintenance deck doors opened. Sova walked in, composed and alert in the way that suggested she had been awake already, her gold eyes finding his console and the signal blinking on it before they found him. "Show me," she said. He showed her. And whatever he had expected from her expression when she understood what she was looking at, what he got was something he had not predicted. She looked at the signal. She looked at him. And she said, quietly and with complete certainty, "You found this because of the translation study." "Yes." "You taught yourself Keth encoding patterns." "I taught myself Keth vocabulary first," he said. "The encoding patterns came later. It was a natural extension." "No one asked you to do this?" "No," he agreed. "I was curious." She was quiet for a moment that felt different from her other pauses, fuller somehow, like something was moving through it on its way to becoming a word. "Reeves," she said. "Yes." "I need to tell you something." He waited. She looked at the blinking signal on his console, and then she looked at him, and she said something that an empress who had come herself when she didn't need to, who had said 11 words and turned 3 vessels around, who drank bad coffee and sent messages with a dash and an initial, probably should have said a little sooner. But this was, he was learning, how she operated, carefully, deliberately, not before she was certain. "I did not come to Meridian Station only because of the consortium," she said. "I came because my daughter asked me to find the man who sat on the floor. She wanted to know if he was the kind of person she thought he was." She held his gaze. "I came to answer her question." Reeves looked at the blinking signal, looked at her. "What's your answer?" he asked. Sova said nothing for a moment. Then, with the quiet finality of someone who had been precise and careful and deliberate about every word she had ever said in her life, and was choosing to continue being all of those things right now, "I think she was right about you," she said. The signal blinked, the station hummed, and Reeves decided that the consortium's timing was deeply inconvenient, and they were going to address it anyway. The encrypted signal traced back to a maintenance worker on sub-level 4 named Dorin, which was the kind of revelation that landed quietly and then got louder the longer you sat with it. Not a consortium agent planted months in advance with a fabricated identity and a deep cover legend. A maintenance worker, someone who had been on Meridian Station for 3 years, who had a shift schedule and a locker in the technical crew quarters, and a reputation among his colleagues for being reliable and unremarkable, who had apparently been approached by the consortium 6 weeks ago with an offer that his salary had made difficult to refuse. Reeves understood this in the way that people understood things that were uncomfortable to understand. Not with sympathy exactly, but with the specific clarity of someone who knew what a maintenance worker's salary looked like and what it didn't cover, and how that gap felt over 3 years of reliable and unremarkable service. He understood it, and he set it to one side, because understanding why something happened and deciding what to do about it were 2 separate processes, and the second one needed to happen quickly. Sova had looked at the signal trace for approximately 4 minutes, asked 3 precise questions about the relay architecture Dorin had used, and then made a decision that Reeves had not anticipated. "Do not flag him to security yet," she said. He looked at her. "He's transmitting to the consortium vessels. Every hour he's active, they're receiving position data, crew movement patterns, defensive response times." "Yes," she said, "and while he is transmitting, we know exactly what they are receiving. The moment he is detained, they know they have been found, and they adjust accordingly." She looked at his console. "What we have right now is better than an arrest. We have a window into what they believe they know." Reeves sat back in his chair and processed this, following the logic through its implications. "We feed them bad information through him," he said. "We allow them to continue believing their intelligence is intact while controlling what that intelligence contains." "Yes," Sova said. "Can you do this without alerting him that the signal has been identified?" He looked at the relay architecture on his screen. It was not sophisticated work. Dorin was a maintenance worker, not a signal specialist, and the consortium had given him tools rather than training. The relay points were using a standard commercial encryption package that Reeves had reverse-engineered in his self-directed study because it appeared in the same documentation set as the Keth encoding patterns, and he had read the whole document rather than stopping at the relevant section. "Yes," he said, "I can do this." Sova looked at him with that careful gold gaze. "Then we have a conversation to have," she said, "about what we want them to believe." They worked through the night, not dramatically, not with the heightened atmosphere that Reeves associated with crises, the raised voices and urgent movement and sense of everything accelerating toward a point. They worked the way that competent people worked on difficult problems, which was steadily and methodically, with long stretches of focused silence and occasional short exchanges that moved the problem forward in small, precise increments. Sova sat across from his console with a data pad, building the information architecture they would feed through Dorin's signal. True enough to be plausible, shaped carefully enough to guide the consortium toward a conclusion that served their purposes. Reeves handled the technical layer, modifying the relay points in increments small enough that no monitoring system would flag the changes as intervention. He had spent 14 months learning this station's systems from the inside. He knew exactly how much he could touch without leaving a trace. By 0500, the work was done. The signal was intact. The information flowing through it was no longer accurate. Somewhere in the transit lane, 3 vessels were receiving data that told them Meridian Station's defensive response time was significantly slower than it was, that the Keth vessel in Bay 3 was operating on a reduced crew due to a routine maintenance cycle, and that the station's primary communications array had a recurring fault that created a 12-minute window of degraded external contact every 18 hours. None of this was true. All of it was specific enough to be believed. Reeves made 2 cups of commissary coffee. He had not yet found better coffee. He had 1 day remaining on his deadline and had not forgotten it, but the night had intervened. He brought both cups to the console area and set one near Sova's datapad without comment. She picked it up without comment. They drank bad coffee in the early station morning. The corridor outside his section quiet and dim, on the overnight lighting cycle, and Reeves thought about the shape of the night just past, about working alongside someone in silence and finding the silence functional rather than awkward, about the specific quality of competence that expressed itself not in performance but in the simple fact of problems getting smaller. He had worked alongside a lot of people in 14 months on Meridian Station. He had not worked alongside anyone who thought the way she did. Not faster exactly, but more completely. The way a calculation was more complete when it accounted for every variable, rather than the obvious ones. "Can I ask you something?" he said when the coffee was half gone and the console showed all nominal readings and the manufactured signal was transmitting cleanly into the dark. "Yes," she said. "The consortium approached Doran 6 weeks ago," he said. "You said your network flagged my name in their communications 8 months ago, which means for 2 months, between when they filed the personnel request and when they started working on station assets, they were doing something else. What were they doing?" Sova set her cup down. "Building a case," she said. "For what?" "For the argument that my declaration in Bay 7 was an overreach, that I had no legitimate basis for placing a human civilian under Keth protection, that the declaration was politically motivated rather than grounded in the Ninth Accord's protection frameworks." She looked at him steadily. "They have been consulting with 3 other interstellar entities who have standing to formally contest a Keth protection declaration. If they can get one of those entities to file a challenge, the declaration enters arbitration and becomes legally suspended, pending resolution." Reeves absorbed this. "How long does arbitration take?" "Years," Sova said, "typically between 3 and 7, depending on the complexity of the case. And during arbitration, the protection is considered inactive." He looked at his console, looked at the clean readings, looked at the manufactured signal going out into the transit lane, like a careful lie wrapped in technical precision. "So the 3 vessels weren't meant to intimidate," he said slowly. "They were meant to provoke a response, something they could use in the arbitration case, evidence that the Dominion was willing to use military presence in a civilian transit corridor to enforce a disputed protection claim. Evidence that I had overstepped," Sova confirmed, "that the declaration was coercive rather than legitimate." He thought about 11 words and 3 vessels turning around. "You knew that when you made the transmission," he said. "You knew they needed you to escalate, and you gave them the opposite." "I gave them withdrawal without confrontation," she said, "which they cannot use. They needed aggression. I gave them restraint."
"And they couldn't call it a bluff because calling it meant admitting they were testing you."
"Yes," he sat back in his chair. "This is not a commercial dispute," he said. "No," she agreed, "it never was. This is about whether your protection declaration holds legally. It is about," Sova said carefully, "whether one person's word is sufficient to change the weight of political calculation, whether a declaration made from personal rather than political motivation is a legitimate exercise of sovereign authority or an abuse of it." The words landed with a precision that felt deliberate, personal rather than political motivation. He let that sit. "Is it?" he asked. "A legitimate exercise?" She looked at him for a moment that had the quality of her longer pauses, load-bearing, moving toward something. "That," she said, "depends on the motivation." "What is the motivation?" he asked. Sova picked up her datapad, looked at it, set it down again. It was the first thing he had seen her do that looked like what it was, a person buying a moment. Finding the right words rather than having them ready. "When Mira told me what you did," she said, "I felt something that I did not immediately have a name for. I have since had 8 months to identify it." She looked at him directly, with the specific quality of attention she gave to things she had decided to be precise about. "It was recognition," she said. "The feeling of seeing something you had not known you were looking for and understanding immediately what it was." The console hummed. The signal transmitted. The corridor outside was quiet and dim and belonged to the hours that existed between one day and the next. "I know what that feels like," Reeves said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "I thought you might." Neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. Some things, Reeves was learning, resolved themselves more completely in silence than in words, the way a complex system sometimes stabilized when you stopped interfering with it and let it find its own equilibrium. He finished his coffee, she finished hers. The station moved through its night cycle around them, indifferent and reliable, doing what stations did. At 0700, the morning crew began arriving at the technical section, and Reeves handed off the console monitoring to his shift replacement, with instructions about the signal parameters that were technical enough to be plausible as routine maintenance, and did not require explanation of their actual purpose. Sova had returned to Bay 3 an hour earlier, moving through the corridor with the same unhurried authority she carried everywhere, pausing at the junction point to look back at him once, a brief, deliberate pause, the kind that said something without saying it, before continuing toward the docking ring. He had a full shift ahead of him. External sensor maintenance, a coolant inspection on sub-level 2, the ongoing credential processing for Keth crew members that he had been working through in stages. He had also, he realized as he walked to the commissary for breakfast, one remaining day on a coffee deadline that had started as a practical arrangement and had somewhere along the way become something that felt more like a small personal commitment. He thought about this while eating. Then he conned the station's freight receiving office and asked about incoming supply shipments. Then he commed a commercial vendor 3 stations along the corridor who had a catalogue that included specialty items not available in the standard Meridian commissary stock. He placed an order. He flagged it for priority delivery. He paid for the priority himself because flagging personal items through station accounts was not a thing he was willing to do, and the amount was more than he would normally spend on anything that was not essential equipment. And he did it anyway without deliberating about it for very long. The order was confirmed, delivery estimated in 18 hours. He went to work. The day passed in the productive, ordinary way of days that had large things moving underneath their surface, full of small tasks and routine maintenance, and the specific texture of work that anchored a person while their mind processed something too significant to look at directly. He replaced 3 sensor modules on the external array. He completed the sub-level 2 coolant inspection and found 2 minor faults that he corrected without needing to escalate. He processed 14 crew credential applications and made real progress on the remaining stack. He ate lunch at his console and dinner in the commissary, and did not see Sova, which was not unusual. The station was large enough that 2 people could occupy it for days without crossing paths unless they chose to. He was aware of her the way he was aware of the 3 vessels still holding at the transit lane boundary, as a presence at the edge of his attention that he was not ignoring, simply not addressing in this particular moment. At 2100, his personal communicator chimed with a freight notification. Package arrived early. Bay 3 receiving dock. He finished the shift note he was writing, saved it, and went to pick it up. The package was small, a sealed container, vacuum preserved, carrying the name of a roasting operation 3 stations away that sourced beans from a human agricultural colony and had a catalogue description that Reeves had read 4 times to make sure he was interpreting it correctly before ordering. He carried it to the commissary kitchen, which was empty at this hour, and spent 20 minutes using equipment he had to read the instructions for, because he had never previously cared enough about coffee to make it with anything other than the station's automated system. The result, when he poured it, looked correct, smelled correct. He tasted it, and it was, in his honest assessment, significantly better than the commissary's standard offering. He put it in a sealed thermal container. He walked to Bay 3. He combed ahead because arriving unannounced at an Empress's ship at 2130 felt like the kind of choice that deserved a warning. Her response came quickly. "The ramp is open." He walked up. The interior of the Keth vessel was not what he had imagined, though he realized upon seeing it that he had been imagining something formal and austere, a space designed to express power. What he found was a space designed for someone who lived in it, functional and carefully arranged, with the particular organization of a person who spent significant time in transit and had learned to make any space feel like theirs. Sova was at a workstation near the viewport wall, which looked out at Bay 3's interior, less dramatic than open space but real, like she preferred reality to the performance of it. She turned when he entered. He held up the thermal container. "One day," he said. She looked at it, looked at him, and for the first time since she had descended the ramp in Bay 7 with the full weight of 63 systems behind her posture, Sova smiled. Not the almost smile, not the carefully contained version, a real one, complete and unhurried, the kind that changed the whole architecture of a person's face and made you understand something about who they were underneath everything they were required to be. It lasted only a moment, but it was a moment that Reeves knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read the difference between small things and things that only looked small, that he was going to remember for a very long time. He poured the coffee. She took the cup. She tasted it, set the cup down. "This," she said, "is adequate." He recognized adequate. He had used it himself recently, about a docking bay. He smiled. "High praise," he said. "From me," she confirmed. "Yes." They sat on opposite sides of her workstation, the coffee between them, the bay quiet around the ship, the transit lane outside carrying its slow traffic of vessels that had no idea what was being arranged in the spaces between their routes. And they talked. Not about the consortium or the arbitration challenge, or the manufactured signal, or the 6 to 8 weeks of institutional deliberation moving toward its conclusion somewhere in the dark. They talked the way two people talked when the crisis had paused long enough to let them remember that they were people first and participants in a complicated situation second. She asked him about the translation application and how he had started using it. He asked her about the 9th accord and what it actually said versus what people assumed it said. She described growing up in a position that was not chosen and the specific discipline of learning to inhabit it without being consumed by it. He described growing up in a family of people who were spectacular in various directions and the specific discipline of learning that ordinary done with care was its own kind of spectacular. She was quiet after he said that. Then she said, "Mira is going to like you very much." "She already gave me positive marks on the protein bar evaluation," Reeves said. "That was a low bar." "She is 8, he said. "The bar is appropriate." Sova's expression did the thing it had been doing more frequently, settling into warmth without requiring permission from the composure first. Like the composure had decided he was not someone it needed to maintain itself against. He registered this, filed it in the place where he was keeping the growing collection of things about her that he was being careful with, that he did not want to be wrong about, that were becoming harder to be careful with because they kept accumulating. The coffee cooled. The conversation continued. The station turned through its night cycle outside, and the consortium's 3 vessels held their position at the transit lane boundary, waiting for intelligence that was no longer accurate, planning around a reality that had already shifted, preparing for a version of the situation that no longer existed, which was, Reeves thought, what happened when you decided that a person was only as significant as what you needed them for. You stopped watching who they actually were, and then you were surprised by what they turned out to be capable of. The arbitration challenge arrived through official channels on a Tuesday, which felt deeply inappropriate for something of its magnitude. Tuesdays were for calibration cycles and inventory checks, and the kind of administrative backlog that accumulated quietly during weeks when larger things demanded attention. Reeves was replacing a faulty relay coupling in sub-level 3 when his communicator delivered the notification. A formal filing from the Interstellar Commerce Mediation Body, citing 3 co-signatories, requesting suspension of the Keth Dominion's Protection Declaration, pending review of its legal basis under the 9th Accord's civilian sovereignty provisions. He read it twice, put his communicator away, finished replacing the coupling. Then he went to find Sova. She already knew. Of course she did. Her communications network operated on timelines that made Meridian's official channels look like handwritten correspondence sent by slow freight. She was at her workstation in Bay 3 when he arrived, her datapad showing the filing in full, her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who had anticipated a thing exactly and was taking no satisfaction from being right about it. "How long do we have before the declaration is formally suspended?" Reeves asked, sitting down across from her in the place that had become, over the past 2 weeks, the place where he sat when they needed to think through something together. 72 hours, she said. The filing requires a response within that window, or the suspension takes effect automatically. And the response needs to be what exactly? A legal counter-argument, she said, filed through the mediation body, demonstrating that the declaration falls within the Ninth Accord's legitimate protection frameworks, that it was not coercive, not politically motivated, and not an overreach of sovereign authority. She set the datapad down. I have a legal team. They are already working on it. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those gold eyes that had stopped being unreadable to him somewhere around day 4 of her presence on the station. He could read them now, not fully. She was too disciplined for full transparency. But enough. Enough to see the thing she wasn't saying. What's the problem with the counter-argument? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. The Ninth Accord's protection framework requires that a declaration be grounded in one of 3 bases, she said. Political alliance, formal treaty obligation, or what the Accord calls demonstrated relational standing. Which means, he said, the declaring party must demonstrate a relationship with the protected individual that constitutes a legitimate basis for protection. Not a professional relationship, not a diplomatic arrangement. The Accord is specific. He followed the logic to where it was going and arrived there a half step before she said it. A personal one, he said. She held his gaze. Yes. The word sat between them with the weight of everything that had been accumulating in careful silence for 2 weeks, in commissary corridors and maintenance decks, and conversations that ran past midnight, and cups of coffee that had become the quiet infrastructure of something neither of them had named yet, because naming it required a kind of certainty they had both been approaching from a deliberate distance. Your legal team, he said, they can make the argument? They can construct it, she said, based on my account of the events, my daughter's account. The demonstrated pattern of my actions since the initial intelligence report, she paused. But the mediation body's review process includes testimony, live testimony, before a panel. They will ask me directly under the Accord's verification protocols to characterize the nature of the relationship that grounds the declaration. The verification protocols, he said, are they similar to a truth circle? She looked at him with something that shifted in its quality. Surprised, he realized that he had made that connection. Similar in function, she said, different in mechanism. But yes, what you say before the panel is assessed for verifiable accuracy in real time. So you can't construct the argument, he said. You have to mean it. Yes, Sova said very quietly. I have to mean it. The workstation hummed. Bay 3 was quiet around the ship. Reeves looked at the datapad with the arbitration filing still visible on its screen and thought about 72 hours and legal frameworks and the Ninth Accord's specific and deliberate language about demonstrated relational standing. He thought about 8 months of intelligence reports and a corridor floor and a protein bar and bad coffee and good coffee and 11 words that turned 3 vessels around. He thought about the shape of the last 2 weeks and what it had felt like to work alongside someone who thought completely rather than quickly, who said things they meant and did not say things they didn't, who had come herself when she didn't need to and had not yet fully explained that except in the language of careful silences that he had learned to read. Sova, he said. She waited. He had learned that too, that she waited for complete thoughts, that she didn't fill the space before he was finished, that she gave words the room they needed to be said properly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it the way you would answer it in front of the mediation body panel, he said. Not the diplomatic version, not the constructed argument, the accurate one. Ask, she said. He met her eyes. What am I to you? The silence was the longest she had ever given him, not the evasive kind, not the kind that meant she was withholding, the kind that meant she was finding the words that were true enough to deserve to be said, sorting through the ones that were almost right, and setting them aside until she reached the ones that were completely right. Because she was a person who did not use language carelessly, and this was not a moment for carelessness. "You are," she said finally, with the quiet precision of someone reading a measurement they have taken multiple times and arrived at the same result. "The person I think about when I am not thinking about anything else.
The person whose judgment I trust more quickly than I have trusted anyone's in a very long time.
The person my daughter chose correctly, and whose correctness I have spent 8 months confirming, and whose presence on this station I arranged to extend not because the situation required it, but because I was not ready for it to end." She held his gaze without moving. "You are the person I came myself for," she said. "Not for the consortium, not for the arbitration, for you. Because you sat on a floor and tried to say 3 words in a language you had no reason to know, and my daughter stopped crying, and I needed to understand what kind of person did that." She paused once more. "I understand now." The bay was completely quiet. Reeves sat with what she had said and let it settle into the place where he had been keeping the careful, accumulating collection of things about her, and felt the collection resolve into something that was no longer careful or accumulating, but simply present, fully formed, the way a system stabilized when all the variables were finally accounted for. "Your legal team," he said. "Tell them the argument is solid." Something moved through her expression, the relief of a thing that has been held under controlled pressure, finally being released into open air. Not dramatic, not loud, just real. "I will tell them," she said. He nodded. Then, because he was a person who expressed things in practical terms before emotional ones, and she had been learning that about him the same way he had been learning her silences, he said, "I should probably give testimony too, if the panel wants corroborating accounts." "You would not be required to," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the argument is stronger with it, and the argument should be as strong as possible." She looked at him steadily. "Reeves." "Yes. That is not why you are offering." It was not a question. He held her gaze. "No," he said, "it is not." The testimony before the mediation body panel happened 31 hours later, via secure transmission, in the small hours of the station's night cycle, when the docking bay was quiet and the transit lanes outside carried only their minimum traffic. Sova's legal team had filed the counter-argument at the 18-hour mark, precise and comprehensive, built on the foundation of 8 months of demonstrated action and 2 weeks of presence that had not been required and had happened anyway. The panel's questions were methodical and specific, the kind designed to find the edges of a statement and test whether it held under pressure. Sova answered them with the same quality she brought to everything, completely without performance, meaning what she said in the verifiable way that the panel's protocols could assess in real time. The verification readings held for every answer. Reeves testified after her. He had prepared nothing written because prepared statements felt like the wrong approach for a process designed to assess accuracy rather than presentation. He answered what was asked. He described 8 months in his own terms, a station, a job, an ordinary life that had been interrupted by something extraordinary and had not returned to ordinary, and had not, he realized while saying it, wanted to. He described 2 weeks in the terms they deserved, not dramatized, not minimized, exactly what they had been. The verification held for his answers too. The panel deliberated for 4 hours. Their finding came through at 0600 station time, formatted in the mediation body's careful official language, which Reeves's translation application rendered with the specific clarity of text that had been written to be unambiguous. The arbitration challenge was rejected. The protection declaration was confirmed as falling within the Ninth Accord's legitimate frameworks. The co-signatories' filing was dismissed with a notation that future challenges on similar grounds would require substantially stronger procedural basis. The consortium's approach, the panel noted in its supplementary remarks, showed no evidence of legitimate commercial grievance. They recommended the corridor's transit authority open a formal inquiry into consortium activities in the region. It was, in the end, 4 hours of deliberation and 1 document. It was also, Reeves understood, something considerably larger than a document. It was the thing that happened when 63 systems, plus 1 ordinary technician with a translation application and a consistent pattern of small kindnesses, turned out to be more than a political calculation had accounted for. He was at his console when the finding came through, running his morning diagnostics with the methodical focus of someone who had been awake for most of the night and had chosen to stay functional through work rather than rest. His communicator chimed with a message from Bay 3, 11 minutes after the official notification arrived. It read, "Come when you can. There is something I would like to say in person." He saved his diagnostic log. He told Petra he was taking a break, which was technically true if imprecise about the nature of the break. He walked to Bay 3. The ramp was open. Sova was standing at the viewport wall, looking out at the bay interior, her posture carrying something different from its usual quality, not relaxed exactly, but lighter. Like a weight that had been present so long it had become part of the architecture had shifted. She turned when he came in. She did not have anything formal prepared. He could tell because she looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone who had decided what they wanted to say, and was choosing to say it simply rather than perfectly. "Thank you," she said, "for the testimony." "The argument needed it," he said. "I told you." "Reeves," he waited. "I am not thanking you for the strategic contribution," she said. "I am thanking you for choosing to stand beside something that was mine, when you had no obligation to, when the risk was real." She held his gaze. "I do not take that lightly." He looked at her, at the gold eyes and the luminescent skin and the silver-white hair, and all the accumulated specific details of a person he had been learning for 2 weeks, with the same focused curiosity he brought to any system worth understanding. He thought about what she had said to the panel, and what he had said to the panel, and the verification readings that had held for both of them, because they had both been saying true things. He thought about a small girl in a corridor, and bad coffee and good coffee and 11 words, and the careful, particular distance they had both been maintaining around the thing that had been building in the space between them, a distance that had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. "I have something to tell you," he said, "in the interest of accuracy." She waited. "The testimony was for the argument," he said, "but I would have been there regardless, for the same reason you came yourself." Something in her expression completed itself. The thing that had been building toward being said finished arriving. She crossed the space between them, not in 4 purposeful strides the way she had once crossed a cantina. This was different, deliberate and personal, and unhurried. And when she was close enough that he could see the faint luminescent pulse in her skin that matched the markings on her ship, she did something that was not political, and not diplomatic, and not sovereign in any official sense. She took his hand carefully, in both of hers, the way you held something you had been looking for and had found in the last place you expected. "Mira was right about you," she said softly. "You told me that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it again, in the right context." He looked at their hands, looked at her, and said with the honesty of someone who had learned from a person who valued it above most things, "I think she was right about you too." Outside in the transit lane, a cargo hauler began its slow approach to the docking queue, dented and mismatched and reliable, doing what it had always done. The consortium's vessels had withdrawn from the boundary during the night, quietly, without announcement, the way things withdrew when the calculation had irrevocably changed. Doran had been quietly escorted to station security that morning, his signal permanently severed, the last piece of the manufactured intelligence operation dismantled now that it had served its purpose. The corridor would be subject to formal inquiry. The station's supply arrangements would be restructured on better terms, without leverage built into the foundation. These were the large things, the ones that would be documented and reported and discussed in transit authority briefings for months. But there were also the small things, which were not small. A protection declaration that had been tested and had held. A panel finding that had established, in legally binding terms, that demonstrated relational standing was a legitimate basis for the full weight of 63 systems. A technician who had taught himself a language out of curiosity and had been in the right corridor at the right moment and had sat on the floor because it seemed like the obvious thing to do. And an empress who had come herself, which told you everything you needed to know if you were paying attention to the right details. 3 weeks later, a Keth diplomatic vessel arrived at Meridian Station for a scheduled visit. It was smaller than Sova's ship, configured for civilian transit rather than sovereign travel, and it docked at Bay 4 with the quiet efficiency of a vessel making a routine stop. Reeves was at his console when the manifest came through. He looked at the passenger list for approximately 1 second before he was on his feet. He reached Bay 4 in 8 minutes, which was faster than he had moved through the station's corridors since the morning 3 consortium vessels had appeared on the transit lane boundary. The ramp was down. A small figure stood at the top of it, dark-eyed and silver-tinted, and wearing an expression of intense, focused recognition, the expression of someone who had been told a story about a person many times and was now checking whether the person matched the story. He stopped at the base of the ramp and looked up. She looked down. "You're taller than I remembered," she said in careful standard that had the particular quality of a child who had practiced a sentence before using it. "You're exactly how I remembered," he said. She came down the ramp with the deliberate steps of someone exercising patience when they would prefer to move faster. She stopped in front of him, studied him with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned to make evaluation invisible. Then she said, "Mama said you found better coffee." "I did," he said. "She said it was adequate." "That's what she said, yes." Mira considered this. "Adequate means she liked it very much," she said. "She doesn't use words like that for things that are only adequate." "I know," Reeves said. The child looked at him for another moment. Then she reached into the small bag she was carrying and produced, with the gravity of someone presenting something they had been keeping safe for a significant journey, a protein bar. Standard issue, the same kind he had given her in a corridor 8 months ago. She held it out to him. He took it. He understood what it was, not food, a thing she had been saving, a thing she had brought across however many light years separated Keth from this corridor to give back, because she was the daughter of a woman who understood that some gestures completed themselves only when they were returned. He crouched down so he was not taller than her. She watched him do this with an expression that was very young and very certain at the same time. "Thank you," he said, "for coming." "Mama is coming tomorrow," Mira said. "On her ship. She said to tell you." "I know," he said. "She told me." "She tells you things," Mira observed, with the specific satisfaction of a child whose theory about something has been confirmed. "She does," Reeves agreed. Mira nodded once. The matter settled in her mind to her complete satisfaction. Then she looked at the bay around her with bright, curious eyes and said, "Can I see the sensors? Mama said you fix sensors. I want to see how they work." He stood up. "I can show you the whole system," he said, "if you want." She did want. He could tell because her expression cleared into the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who had been offered something they had not expected to receive and had decided immediately that they were going to enjoy it completely. They walked together into the station, a technician and a child, the protein bar in his pocket and the translation application on his communicator, and the morning shift just beginning around them. And somewhere in the transit lane, moving toward Meridian Station on a heading that had been filed 3 weeks ago and confirmed twice since, a charcoal grey ship with silver markings that pulsed like something breathing was making its approach. Coming back, not because the situation required it, because she chose to. Every day she kept choosing. There are moments in life so quiet you almost miss them. A floor you sat on, a word you tried to say, a bar of food you shared without thinking twice. This story is about what happens when those moments turn out to be the ones that mattered most. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to know what it was. And if you're the kind of person who finds themselves in the right corridor at the right time, doing the obvious thing when others walk past, HFY Soundscape is made for you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the universe is full of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we are just getting started.